Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
And today we have with us James Howson from the University of Texas in Austin. He's talking a little bit about some work that he's been doing investigating the role that software can play, should play in academic reputation. Very relevant to some of the work that we're doing here on academic search as well. So welcome, James.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Alex. So it's my pleasure to be here this morning. Today I'm going to be talking about joint work with Jim Herbsleb at Carnegie Mellon. And we're going to be talking about software work in science and how it interacts with the scientific reputation system. So, I mean, to kick off, software is increasingly a really big deal in the practice of science. And, you know, we kind of knew that going into this work, but we're constantly blown away by the amount of software work that scientists are doing in the conduct of their science and in their larger collaborations. So there's a survey by Hannay et al., and they found that scientists are spending between 30 to 40% of their time, 30% actually kind of writing software, and maybe 40% for other people, you know, using software in the conduct of their work, right? Obviously, the agenda for cyberinfrastructure, that's big at the NSF and other funding agencies, essentially says that using new computational methods, especially software, we can change the scale at which we do science and change the efficiency and effectiveness and innovativeness in which we do science. And it's also the case, I thought this was quite interesting, in biology. And so here we have, this is gigabase pairs, and this is a log scale cost, right? The cost of collecting data is staying approximately the same. The cost of then analyzing that data is shooting through the roof, right? So this is, you know, close to an exponential rise, and those are numbers based on EC2 figures just as a comparison basis. And so what this essentially says is, at least in biology, it's getting cheaper, relatively cheaper to collect the data, but then the more data you have and the bigger database you have to compare it against, the more permutations you have to compare, and the more computationally expensive it gets, and the more relevant, you know, good, effective software is to science. So this raises essentially a science policy challenge, which is how can we improve scientific software? Which isn't to say it's doing a terrible job. I'm not saying, you know, I'm here from software engineering and I'm here to help and you should have a personal software practice. That may be true, but we know that the Republic of Science works in the ways that it works, and that scientists have produced a lot of really good software. So the question is, how can we look at these different aspects like correctness, efficiency, reproducibility, and innovativeness, and come up with policies that promote those in ways that accord with how we do science today. And as you'll see, we've got some ideas. We're looking forward to speaking to people in the group here about how we tie in different types of software contributions by scientists into the existing reputation system. But today I'm going to be talking about a specific study about modularity in software. And so this is really a candidate policy for trying to improve the development of scientific software. And so modularity is, I think, people who build software are relatively familiar with the idea that if you can split the problem up into chunks that are that keep similar functionality close together and reduce unnecessary interaction between different parts of the software base, then not only can you get software that is easier to develop and easier to test, but also organizationally, it's easier then to have people from different areas work on and develop that software because they can work inside those different modules. And so this makes modularity as a system for designing an innovation ecosystem a really appealing policy idea. So what do we know about modularity as a way of organizing innovation? So this is great work by Baldwin and Clark out of Harvard Business School that go back and look at the IBM 360 system, way back in the early days, where we took what was a monolithic system, the old IBM systems, and broke it up into modules, the computer architecture, broke it up into modules, and then made other groups able to do things like sell a hard drive that would plug into the unit, and then and that's what gives us the commodity computer systems of today, right? And what that means is that different people can sell different types of modules or provide different types of modules, and you can do design experiments that are separate from the rest of the system but integrated with it, which let you find unexpectedly great ways to do different parts of the system. This literature has been largely developed in the for-profit literature, right, where people are really thinking about different companies that are going to sell different components, or situations where a system integrator is going to pay contractors to develop different components and then put them together. And part of what I'm going to talk about today is why doing it with money is different than doing it with reputation. And that's what ties back to the scholarly literature. But we've also talked about this in the open source arena, where modularity has been called an architecture of participation, which is to say that when things are broken up in good ways, it's easier for volunteers and people from outside to come in and work on small parts of the code. And so that's additional work by Baldwin Clark and also West and Omani. And this is pretty appealing in the scientific context. If we want to improve the software collectively, drawing on the sort of communalism of science and the hopeful ability to work together, always with a little star next to it, remembering that science is also competitive, then perhaps an architecture would be useful. A more modular architecture would be useful. So there's some good evidence that you can actually do this. You can take an existing software project, remodularize the code base, and change the way the development around that code base is organized. And so Alan McCormack did a study looking at comparing Linux and Netscape. And so when Netscape went to the Mozilla Foundation, it had been developed relatively in-house and unsurprisingly had a relatively monolithic code base, right? Intentionally, they wanted to design that to reduce the coupling between the different units in order to attract outside participation volunteers. And they were actually able to do that. And this paper shows that it at least is credibly linked to the growth of volunteer participation in Firefox, together with a campaign to bring people in. All right. So that's kind of the research setting here. Sorry, that's the research background. The research setting is a study of BLAST. And so BLAST is a crucial piece of scientific software. It really does lookups against DNA databases. Okay, so for many years, when biologists have produced a sequence from an organism, they've taken it and they put it in GenBank, which is a publicly accessible database with all these sequences. So let's say you dig up some ants out of the ground in Guatemala, as one of the people I studied do, and you know that there's also a bunch of microbes and things in there. You can then shotgun sequence that whole chunk and look at a special gene called 16S and compare that to the database and get back best guess identifications of all the organisms that are in your little ecological system. How do you do that? Well, you do it with a version of optimal string matching, which is implemented in the BLAST software. All right. So it's a hugely important piece of software, as you can imagine. And in 2003, there was a paper that argued that it was the third most cited scientific paper ever. Okay, so in some situations, scientific software ends up really well cited. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So in 2008, this software code underwent a full refactoring to move to a more modular architecture. So the study here looks at innovation before that in the system, and especially contributions from outside, and the situation afterwards to see if there's any changes. All right. So the research questions here are, who created, maintains, and improves BLAST? Okay, so both the software itself and, as we'll see, possible outside improvements. What motivates those participants to develop that software, to reveal it to others, and possibly to integrate it back into the central code base? And finally, how does a move to a more modular architecture for the BLAST software change the innovation system? So I should say, if you want any clarifications or anything, just jump in and ask me. All right, so what's the data and method here? It is looking at published papers and code. And so we've identified 11 improvements to the BLAST system that were produced and are relevant. And we're doing semi-structured interviews with the creators of these systems. Okay, so we've been able to contact 8 projects out of the 11. And so we get really good insight into the background, the narratives of why these things were created and how they were created. All right, so a little background on BLAST itself. So BLAST was written out and is maintained by the NCBI, which is a center funded by the NIH. All right. Now, so the NCBI was managing GenBank, and so it was a very natural place to kind of think about how you develop code that does lookups against that. And that group actually intentionally gathered trained scientists who also liked to code and brought them into a group that was able to have both in-house biologists who were providing research ideas and good scientific knowledge, but also understanding of algorithms and statistics, which are an important part of this, in doing that. So BLAST was initially developed for use value to do lookups against GenBank, relatively simple. It was also developed towards academic reputation. Part of the idea and the animating idea of NCBI was here was going to be an environment where software contributing scientists, and is an environment where software contributing scientists are recognized for that type of work. And that meant publishing academic papers, something that we're all relatively familiar with. Plus an intention to provide a service to the scientific community, and that's primarily what how NIH views funding this type of research. And so the people who developed the original BLAST system then are authors of those very highly cited papers. Altschul did some of the statistics, and other people were involved as well. All right. So now what I'm going to do is run through about just 4 cases of outside improvements and just talk about what they were and why people built them. All right. And then we'll kind of pull that back together and show a summary slide that kind of explains the innovation ecosystem and then tie that back to reputation. All right. So the first one we'll talk about is something called Wooblast, which was code to implement what's called gapped BLAST. So you can imagine you're doing optimal string matching. You have a big gap in the middle. It would be really nice to be able to say, I've got these strings and match them even if there's a gap. So experiment with that gap. So originally BLAST didn't do that, and that was kind of one of the things that was fairly rapidly identified as something that was worth doing. One of the original developers left NCBI and went to work in an academic career at St. Louis University in Washington, and developed the gapped BLAST idea, still in collaboration with some of the scientists back at NCBI, but very intentionally towards tenure track appointment in a biology department. Okay, so this is now somebody who's building code in that academic environment, and so very clearly was motivated by a desire for tenure, which means building an academic reputation. All right, so these are quotes. It said, this was my research project by which I would be judged on my own merits for tenure. And he decided that he didn't want to release the source code, so he didn't even want to reveal the source code for this, although he was writing papers, for fear that my improvements would be consumed and my case for tenure would be kind of muddied by the belief that code and that idea belonged to other people. All right, so just keep that one in mind. A very different situation here is what's called digital compact BLAST. And so digital and compact were computer companies. Perhaps they are still. And this was about the time that Compact bought digital, but the alpha line of processors was still really important. Okay, and so this was a port of BLAST to that digital alpha platform, and they basically used this to sell the alpha platform, right? So they knew that life scientists increasingly needed to run this computationally heavy piece of software, and it wouldn't be great if they could buy alpha equipment to do that. So they do the port internally, and then they produce some benchmarks saying, look, our hardware really crunches numbers here. So buy it, and we'll support this. And so it's essentially used to sell hardware. Now, they talked about the fact that it's quite expensive to maintain those forks. They're giving the code away so they can sell the hardware. So it's really a complementary goods motivation. And for them, it really made sense to then try to push that code back to NCBI, because their customers were more comfortable using kind of mainline NCBI BLAST than they were using the fork. And maintaining that fork every time NCBI comes out with a new version is relatively expensive. I think this is something that we're actually all relatively familiar with. All right. Slightly different case was a port of BLAST to Mac OS X. And this was actually something that was motivated in a different way. This was created by a guy who worked at the Whitestone Genetic Institute during the Human Genome Program, and had bought a Mac laptop, had OS X on it, liked it, wanted to use those tools on it. It's all kind of autoconf. OS 10 is a Unix underneath. So on the train, but as we know, that's not enough. That means it'll actually compile and work. But so on the train, on his 1-hour commute, he basically ported bioinformatics packages to Mac OS 10. And so he did that for both fun and use value for himself. And it was maintained by that guy who wrote the port. He actually maintained that separately for a couple of years, he said. But Apple hears about this and decides, this is something relevant. And we'll talk about another Apple case in a minute. And so they eventually they provide some, soft support to that. I think they eventually gave him a laptop, maybe a trip out to Cupertino, and an introduction back to NCBI so that he could push those changes back. And eventually those changes do get brought back and incorporated into Blast. All right. So the other case we'll talk about at some length was something called GPU Blast. And this one actually comes after the change to the new modular architecture. Right? So this is a group outside that now wants to implement an update to Blast, and they start with the new modular architecture. And these guys are straight up optimization science guys. They're actually chemistry professors. But apparently chemists also do software optimization. They looked at it and said, Blast's the sort of algorithm that has some parallelizable parts and some interactive parts. Can we use GPUs, and here specifically the NVIDIA platform, to optimize this and drive it really quickly? And other people have tried this before, but they ended up with slightly different results, which makes people very nervous. Even though they're statistically similar, they're not identical. And so these guys do something that's really identical results to the NCBI Blast, just faster, orders of magnitude faster. So they now maintain and still maintain GPU Blast separately on their website. So even though they've drawn from the more modular code base, they've implemented this software and they maintain it on their website, and they've published a paper that describes it. When we interviewed them, that paper was really crucial to why they developed the code in the first place. So these are guys that are motivated by academic credit. And they maintain that separate port because it goes along with that paper. And this is a quote from them that says, the ideal for us would be that NCBI comes to us, right, and says, let's write a paper together and have all the users cite that new paper from now on. So that's kind of that joint paper that will allow us to integrate it. So let's work together to make sure we design this in the best possible way, probably a joint paper, right? That would be the ideal. Pregnant pause. For us. It would be the ideal for them because it would bring in the reputation and the user base of NCBI, but also maintain their role in having provided this code to the academic community and recognition for that work, which, as we know, is a big part of the reputation economy. All right, so those are the types of cases. So we go in, interview people like that, really get the story of how the thing was built, try to understand why it was built that way. All right, and so a summary of that is here. So here we have Blast in the middle. This is the non-modular Blast. This is the remodularized Blast. Each one of these are improvements that, as you see, they all start from the mainline Blast. And that's actually pretty interesting, right? That means this central thing provides an ongoing persistent platform for people's innovation. But there's a big difference between the top half and the bottom half. And that's lines going back up to the core innovation, which is Blast. So all these ones at the top here, you can see are similar to, so the PowerPC port there should actually say OS 10 port. There was also a PowerPC port. These are ones that are motivated, that are primarily primarily commercial things that are associated with complementary goods motivations. The groups down the bottom here are primarily academics. But I don't want to jump to a conclusion that is totally based around reputation. So let's think about what might be explaining this difference where some of them come back in and are folded back in and others are maintained for a while and then kind of drop off. Because a lot of these projects just end up disappearing from the website, but they don't issue a retraction for the paper or anything. So there's this weird relationship between the paper and the software. All right, so the first thing would be kind of intentions. Do people really want to integrate it? Does NCBI want to integrate it? And pretty much all the people we talked to were relatively comfortable with the idea of integration, although some obviously had some conditions based around that, right? We'll integrate if there's a joint paper. But people understand the costs of maintaining that code. So intentions doesn't really explain it because or at least adequately, because all kind of wanted to, and yet only some did, right? Another thing that came up was generalizability. Basically the argument that things should only get introduced back into the core if it applies to the widest group possible. Yeah?
I'm just wondering, how does this generalization, when you think about, the bench work, the amount of time it takes to do a traditional research. Let's say if I do, DNA analysis, or I do a protein extraction. That's a lot of, a lot of bench work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, does that get funneled into this, evaluation? Say, if I want this to be, the experimental. What I mean is that the experimental data gets incorporated into the paper, and from there it gets incorporated into that.
Well, I mean,
is there any process like this? That's what I call infrastructure. I mean, that's my understanding of the infrastructure.
So let me check. I'm getting this right. So it's prototyped in a specific scientific research project. That the software improvement comes out of some bench work where you need a different type of software work, and then from there, having been proved to contribute to science, then goes into the infrastructure that the rest of the community might use.
Like my friend was complaining, he was saying that, sometimes your paper gets accepted or not, it's just like milliseconds, because someone deposits their paper like a minute ahead of you, and then your paper gets rejected, and somebody else's paper, so there's more than what,
The academic reputation system and economy and how it specifically works in different fields is really fascinating.
No,
I mean,
I'm just talking about this field.
okay. So are you saying that priority is really crucial?
I'm just saying, for researchers, you work on for years to get your paper published. Someone, gets ahead of you, and then your paper is academic reputation.
You don't get, yeah. I mean, we talk about how communal science is and that scientists want to cooperate with each other and want to help each other, particularly on infrastructural questions. But we actually also know that science is really competitive, right? And that labs are competing with each other. And in this field, what you're describing is a highly competitive environment. And we know from the literature on kind of data sharing that people are very nervous about the idea that this data set that I've spent all this time creating is just going to be given to everybody just because I got some public money, and then everyone will take the results that I would have mined out of this data set. So a very similar thing, I think, happens with software contributions, although there are some different shapes to it towards the end. Yeah?
Related question, though. Did anybody ever raise as a motivation to preserve/archive the state of the software that was used as a part of their experimentation? Independent of making contributions back up to the main fork, saying, this is the state of the software that corresponds to the research that I did that was published here.
Mm-hmm.
So from a reproducibility point of view, that becomes an interesting artifact down the road.
Sure.
Was that a motivation, or is it, that doesn't matter, I've published my paper on my research, and ideally I could publish a paper on my instance of the software, and those are the artifacts that reflect me in the future?
In this study, no, but in another study, yes. So in this study, most of these improvements were not driven by people who were doing a lot of science for publication, a lot of domain science for publication at the same time. Mm-hmm. So they were primarily focused on software-based contributions. Okay. In another paper that Jim and I have done that was at CSCW in 2011, we actually described a taxonomy of different software contributions. And the one that you're describing there is this, what we call a parallel software practice, where you're doing your mainline science, but you're also writing code that might be useful to others, and then you're publishing a paper to try and create a reputation hook for that paper too. So those motivations definitely exist, but we didn't find them in this specific environment. So, cool. So the second explanation is, look, people have all sorts of crazy ideas for their specific research projects and stuff, but the only ones you want to draw back into the main core are the more generally applicable ideas. And I think that there's really something to that idea. I mean, particularly if you think of yourself as, if you think of, say, what happens in Apache or whatnot, people do think about, does this really apply to everyone, or is this a really specific edge case? And it is relevant, but it doesn't really explain the GPU blast situation, where that's a speed up that could be useful to everybody. It's relatively accessible commodity hardware. We can all buy GPUs and bang them in our desktops or talk to our research academic computing cluster, get GPU access. And yet, there's clearly a motivational conflict that plays a role in that too. So another possible explanation is just straight up integration costs, that there's not a lot of reward to integration, but there's kind of high cost to it, and so pulling it back in is problematic. And in the modularity theory, that's a really crucial part of it, right? You have to have stable APIs, so bringing that module back into the system and improving the whole system is easy. So in this case, it doesn't really explain what we found because projects were already maintaining a merged environment. They'd already done that kind of expensive integration because they wanted to keep their project up to date with the core project. So they're already paying those integration costs. It doesn't really explain it. But more importantly, the modularity element doesn't seem to explain it either, which is also part of the integration cost, because all of the cases that were integrated back in were based on the non-modular blast. And the one case that we have in detail and two other cases we have without interviews are based on the modularized blast, but still not incorporated back in. So it seems like this idea that if you make it more modular, people will make smaller changes and then contribute them back and the whole system will improve, is not really bearing out in the way that you expect in this specific innovation system. And so this finding is kind of counter to what the theory would predict. The modularity theory would say it would just get easier to bring it back in, but we didn't see that. Yes? Of course.
I'm just wondering, did you actually check how that process the paper gets produced?
Which paper?
I mean, when they contribute the paper to the blast.
So
when
we...
you're talking about software, does the software try to say how the process the paper gets generated?
We asked the people who wrote the software who then went on to write a paper, we asked them about the story of the paper.
I know it's the paper. You have a software that can generate the papers. And then you check to say, okay, this paper data that gets into it, how it gets into it. That's my theory. I didn't explain it very well.
No, so in this case, the papers describe the software. So it's not that the papers...
The paper describes the software. Okay, it's not the software that generates the...
No, not in this case, although obviously the software is used in other papers to generate results, but not in this case. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right.
Because I was talking about the nanopopulations, and it's really scary when you think about it.
Okay. We might talk about that. Did you say NanoHub? Is that what you said? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It's very interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Quick question. How long has the modular version of Blast been out?
So it was written in 2007, available in 2008. So I think it's a great question. I think that we need to keep an eye on this. I think that these are results that kind of drive towards the theorization I do afterwards, rather than kind of proving for all time that modularity can't help. So yeah, we need to keep a look at it. Certainly people say that they like working with the modularized version more. So like that part of the theory kind of works a bit. But it does seem that there's a reputation question that drives in there, sort of a motivation question. All right. So just kind of a quick summary of the motivational results. So at the top, you've got stuff that was driven by academic credit and use value and service provision, but no need to do integration because these are developed by NCBI, right? So that's kind of the core stuff. So that seems to work relatively well. Stuff that's driven by complementary goods and use value, they seem to be well motivated for development, very well motivated for revealing, because that's a great way to sell hardware, is have free code, but also well motivated for integration. Okay, so we've got motivations here of complementary goods and maintenance costs that seem to drive integration and motivate that. For the ones that are driven by academic credit, there's good motivations for development, but very clear motivations for revealing, at least the binaries, but also people tend to reveal the source, because after all, that's what you do in the academic reputation economy. You give it away. But no motivations for integration. And that is kind of the key finding here, which is that Academic reputation seems to operate quite specifically in this environment. It motivates development and revealing, but seems to counter-motivate integration. And that's really problematic when you start to think about how can we get scientists working more collectively in their development. Now, financial, so complementary goods is rewarded by money, right? Those and experiential motivations seem well motivated to integrate. They're either complementary or they're just kind of independent. So you had fun building it, and then integrating it doesn't take away the fun you had building it. And reducing maintenance costs is a bonus there. So let's kind of jump back to the modularity theory for a second and talk about how that integration goes. And so essentially, it seems like money talks and credit forks, which is to say, if you're driven and motivated by money, and perhaps experience as well, then integration is relatively, at least in this environment, is relatively well motivated. Or at least is possibly motivated, is not counter-motivated. And that's partially because money is both divisible and transferable. All right, so let's say Alex and I get to know each other a bit, and Alex has written a great system, and I come along and I improve it like 10%, right? Let's say we're running a private company, and Alex says, I think my customers really like that. So I'll subcontract and buy that code that James wrote, and you keep selling your product, but now we have an agreement between us. You keep 90% of the money or profits, and I get 10%, right? Exactly. So it is not the case that just because it's money, things end up exactly equal and nice, right? Apple takes 30% of all people's in-app purchases, and they can do that because they have power in the market, right? But the point is that you can negotiate over that. And once you've negotiated, you can do it. So all that money that you get, we split it up. You keep 91. I take 9. But I keep 9, right? Because money can be divided and transferred. So we can talk about who did what in the project. All right. If it was enjoyment, we don't even have to do that because I had great enjoyment doing it. I make it available to you, and there we go. Use value is the same, right? It's a really local and immediately rewarded motivation. But academic reputation, at least, and probably all reputation, is different. And that's because when we have reputation as a reward in a collective activity, reputation is not like money. It's not a substance, right? It's something that is the result of other people's actions, which means it has to be enacted, and it has to be enacted repeatedly for it to actually have value. And so, a classic enactment is letters of support for tenure, right? But just the day-to-day talking about who made what contribution and who does good work is the stuff of the academic economy. Which means it's about relationships, not about objects in the same sense of money. But also means it's really hard to give away. So to continue the Alex and my discussion, if we agree that my contribution was about 10%, when you give a talk, you can say that every time. You can go, oh, yeah, credit should really go to James, just like I did at the start of this one, saying it's joint work with Jim Herbslab. But realistically, people are talking to you. They remember they got the product from you. They started using it before I made my contribution. And you've got to change their mind in a way that's much harder than just giving me money, right? So there's that. And it's really hard to split up, like to make those distinctions and to say, oh, this guy did that, this group over here did this, she did this portion, and so, think about that. No, objects tend to get associated with their creators. And in this environment, it seemed that people said, well, people cite the original papers. And the original papers tend to be in better publication environments than the improvement papers. And that's problematic. So as kind of an analogy of that, I used to live in Pittsburgh when I was at Carnegie Mellon. And when you're in New Orleans, what's the river in New Orleans? What's that? Very nice. What's the other one? The Mississippi. Right, so Mississippi. Where does the Mississippi start?
Minnesota, northern Canada.
Right, exactly. So it's up here, right? Or maybe that's the Mississippi. But actually, 40% of the water that's flowing past you in New Orleans comes from the Ohio, and a good 40% of that water comes from the Allegheny, which is up here in New York, right? But obviously, it all merges together at the end, but if people remember the mighty Mississippi. And a similar thing goes on when we merge objects in a reputation economy. The original publications and the original creators have this kind of sticky ability, or the reputation is relatively sticky to that object. And when we merge other things in, it seems to be problematic. And so this is something we need to think about when we think about how we're going to organize collective activity in science, particularly cooperative work on software. And that's because we need to think about the objects of regard. All right, so just kind of summing this up now, and then I look forward to questions and conversation. Modular theory is largely developed in the for-profit environment where money kind of has this divisible and fungible aspect, needs a little bit of kind of tweaking in an environment where reputation is the currency. And that's because you can make and integrate changes of limited scope to improve the system. Okay, this is the idea that you can build a better hard drive, you can build a better monitor, and kind of bring it in, and then everyone benefits from those changes to the system. But unless you also have modular incentives that give you a reason to make, reveal, and integrate those changes of a limited scope, then you're not going to get the innovation benefits from modular systems that you expected. And another implication is that incentives can work differently at different stages. So you can have incentives that work for development, that work for revealing, but undermine integration. And you probably have different combinations of that as well. And reflecting on the idea that modularity might be a good piece of science policy, it seems that funding a modular refactoring is probably useful, right? People did like working with the modular code more, but it's probably not sufficient because it doesn't deal with the questions of integration to the extent that academic reputation is the prime motivation. So then the question becomes, well, all right, so we could like improve development and maybe improve correctness by going more modular, but how do we improve integration? And so kind of some possible ways forward here, and we're just starting to think about these, is could you do this through some new policies? And so, people talk about, well, we're going to have a policy if you write a paper and it's got code in it, you have to release that code. And that's great. Okay, that's hard enough and it's kind of controversial, but that's great. We might end up with a lot of forked code out there, so to speak. So should we also say that if you really want to get ideal credit for this, that you shouldn't only release this code, but you should work with the other people and then integrate it? It's kind of tricky, right? Might work. We've got this publication lever. Could do a lot with it. But how do you make the people who aren't publishing that paper want to integrate it with that? I don't know. Ideas on that would be interesting to me. Perhaps you can fund integration as a primary activity, and I have a little bit more hope for this. At the moment, we primarily fund infrastructure developers to write code and make it available, right? We can kind of tweak that idea and say, you guys aren't the Apache HTTPD project committee, right? You're actually the Apache Foundation, and your goal is to create an innovation ecosystem, not to produce code for other people, right? And so you become stewards of that. And I talked to people at like supercomputing centers about that, and they're kind of interested. But it's been very different than what they've been funded to do before, which is have FTEs that write code. Right? There's a whole different skill set, but one that I think is quite interesting. But we really must get at this question of how joint development is going to be reflected in the academic reputation system. How do we account for this? And I'm at a school of information, and so I like to think of this as an information problem, or at least make that argument to my colleagues, which is this is information about contributions. And so I'd love to talk more about this study. Right now I'm just going to pull back just a touch and talk about kind of a little bit of a wider piece of work that we're doing. And so coming back to our overall interest in scientific software, we're really starting to think about how you do improved motivations for kind of all 5 of these functions within the scientific software ecosystem. So development, revealing, integration, and also long-term support and maintenance. And one of the ways we're looking at doing that is building what we're calling the scientific software network map. And so imagine if you had all the papers and you knew for each paper what pieces of software it had used to build its science. And so that's really getting at the question you asked before about how was that software used to produce the science, and who wrote that. And then for each one of those, you could look at what software that software was built on. And you could also ask, where did the contributions towards that piece of software come from? Right? And so now we're talking about not only building bibliometric connections between the papers and the pieces of software that were used for them, but building pseudo-bibliometric connections out to all the software that was used in those, and kind of dividing up those contribution layers. Yes?
And the software, I saw that it integrates with PC. Does it actually integrate with instruments? laboratory instruments?
There's a lot of software inside laboratory instruments, and that went, in another paper we did, we went and looked at, we interviewed people who wrote papers and found out all the software they used, you know, and really nailed hard on them. They're like, so we get the data back from the lab, and I'm like, hey, what software do they use in the lab? Well, you know, it's a chromograph. What software's in the chromograph? Who wrote it? And so, you know, I can give you the reference for that one too, because it's quite interesting. A lot of that's accounted for. Well, we sell the hardware, software goes with it. I think people in this room might be familiar with that.
You know, if they use SharePoint.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
There still seems to be a lot of shoehorning in reputation to the things that make reputation happen today. It's all about the paper and the citation networks on the paper. And I'm just wondering whether or not, so one of the concerns that I have of an approach like this is that the lag time between research and publication being so long that if you were to completely sort of ignore the current reputation system and just look at it purely from a software reputation point of view, would that lead to a different flow? And are there units of citability that aren't papers as citable objects, but modules or releases or distros?
I mean, yes. I think that's really important stuff to think about. You know, the fact that your software gets included in a distro might be a really nice thing for a software contributing scientist to use to make the argument to his or her colleagues that they've made a contribution. But you are eventually going to then have to, it's just a question of indirectness, because you've got to make the argument that the distro drives science, right? That drives good scientific results. Because at the moment, when I talk to scientific software developers, like say in the cyberinfrastructure space, they might count their users, but then their funders are like, yeah, but what innovative science did those users do? And they're like, oh, God, I don't know. I'm going to contact like 100 users and make that case now. So yes, I think we can have citable units that aren't papers. Particularly, I mean, one of the things we're doing, I'll talk about it in 2 secs real quickly, is looking at citation, looking at that question. So, yeah.
How does this reputation mechanism work for open software projects, again, like Mozilla and Linux?
Yeah,
it's
that.
exactly the same, and it's mostly done by the same academic people.
Well, I think it's an open question how much of open source these days is written by the same academics people that is written by academics. Yeah, reputation in open source doesn't seem to have this integration problem, right? And I think that's really curious and needs more thinking. My initial kind of thoughts on that are that reputation is relatively internal. Okay, what really matters is what the other people in the project think about your contributions. And that seems like a finer-grained decision that people are making, whereas academic reputation is primarily of use when you're addressing audiences that don't know your work that carefully, right? So you become, the people who like use the code or work with you closely, they know how you do your work. It's making your case to your dean or external reviewers where like bibliometrics starts to play a role. So I think there's something about the different audiences of reputation, but I'd love to think about that more. So let me just finish by saying that the other work that we're doing in this area. So one thing we're doing is instrumentation, right? So we're going out and we're trying to help scientists instrument their software so that it reports their own use more. Okay, and so that's both with changes to their code, but also developing formats and standards by which they can provide it. Funny thing about scientific software is it shows up, it just comes off people's websites. So there's not even any like top 10 app lists or SourceForge download statistics, as useless as those are in some ways. At least they're there and create information cascades so that people kind of coalesce on good bits of software. Science, it just comes off different web servers and no one really knows. So we're working with different communities, SB Grid. We're going to start working with the R community to try and get some more of this instrumentation and talk about how we could do this. That's one thing. Second is we're going to work on developing the reporting infrastructure for science funding agencies. So when they fund a piece of scientific software development, how does that community report its success? So basically asking them to look at its users, asking them to look at the science better, but really taking advice from the Apache community that uses DOPE, description of a project, to create a distributed catalog that will be kept updated. Because one thing I'm not doing is a survey of all software that will be outdated next month. Not doing that. Finally, want to do an analysis of published papers in 2 ways. One, which is looking at artifacts created in papers maybe things that are left over from the software that allow us to kind of understand what software they used. That's, I think, hopeful, but also limited. And then looking at citation practices, and this is what we're kind of knee-deep in at the moment, which is looking at who cites software, when, what different types of citations are there for software. And one question we can ask there is, do newer papers for software, like do updated papers, actually end up being cited, or do people always cite the original one? And so that would be an interesting thing. So I think one of the things that maybe the scholarly communication group here will be interested in is talking about some of those analysis published papers. So that's it for me. Very much welcome discussion and questions.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Any other questions from the room?
I just had one question about modularity. Have you thought at all about sort of measuring the modularity? So Blast, for example, went through this thing, and do you know how much more modular it is?
I don't. I have thought about doing it. I think it's probably worthwhile as we develop this data set out more, both tracking what continues to happen and kind of putting a number on that would be worthwhile. But we haven't done that yet. We've relied on the people who know the code well to tell us that they did it well, and the people down the track. But it's something worth checking, right? Because if it's not more modular, then what do we really know?
Right.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks.
To what extent, you may not have thought much about this, but to what extent are there parallels to the notion of data citation, especially, you mentioned Protein Data Bank earlier, and there is a paper on Protein Data Bank which is very highly cited. But then there's the issue of contributions where you're not contributing software, you're contributing data into Protein Data Bank. And
Yeah. I mean, I think there's probably a relatively similar phenomenon happening there. I mean, there are some similarities. There are lots of similarities between data and software. They're kind of alternative academic contributions. They're increasingly important. They are kind of small units that are best in combination. Those things are all similar. Software is a little bit different in that I think it probably needs more maintenance, but the ecosystem around the software changes more over time, and so you've got to kind of keep that software functioning within that structure of dependencies. Although, the more I talk to people who deal with data, the more those types of questions come up. So I've been trying to talk to the data site people, but I haven't spoken to anyone or found anyone yet who's kind of really dealt with this question of, do people integrate these data contributions? The general thinking is, you collected the data, you wrote a paper based on it, and now you're going to give the data in, and it doesn't cost you anything to do that, and it has public benefits. The idea that, I'm not sure that there's that many people who just collect data and hope that to be a good scientific contribution. Perhaps there should be.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. I actually kind of am, I find the idea appealing in that particular paper. And the guy that I've spoken to is in Copenhagen, and he says that the closest thing you're able to come to is actually bundling up a virtual machine. So that you get the paper as this, it unpacks, there's the data, there's the software, you can run the data through the software and get the result you see in the paper. And so that seems like a long ways to go. But I do like the idea of software as metadata. So not only you publish a paper, publish a data set, but also, because generally speaking, we have multiple series of processing stages, right? Sort of like a river diagram. Lots of stuff comes together to get to that final result. So anyway, that's just sort of.
Yeah, the executable paper, I think. I mean, it's when your focus is reproducibility, it makes a lot of sense. And perhaps if your focus is transparency, so that I can kind of learn what you did, it also makes a lot of sense. So leaving aside the kind of recursive problem of keeping virtual machines going, if your goal is collective innovation, so I can build on what you did, then kind of packaging and freezing things as they were 3 years ago might not be the best basis for collective innovation, right? Because that code kind of bit rots with respect to the rest of the ecosystem, and now I want to build on top of it. It's a little problematic. So there's a lot to think about there, because at least you get better reproducibility and transparency. Right. It'd be a nice start.
Yeah.
Right?
It's one goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I like Alex's idea about this archive, software archive thing, so that, you know, we create the almanacs of, you know, of the software, you know, how it evolves over time and the paper associated. And then, you know, the configurability of that paper gets, you know, how it evolves over time, because we training the checking process.
I think it's really, at the moment, we sort of say to scientists, you know, it'd be nice if you open sourced your code, right? And what we really, and then there's some group that, some people who think that that's what we want for reproducibility. There's some people who think that's enough to get collaboration, right? And in my mind, it's not nearly enough to get collaboration. And in fact, it could be problematic. And so we have another paper where we look at what we call different logics of correctness in software. And so there's basically three, and they're a little bit freaky if you're a software engineer. Okay, but first one is, I wrote it myself, I know it really well, right? Second one is, somebody else wrote it, lots of people use it, I'm sure it's correct. That's basically a version of the many eyes make all bugs shallow argument. The third one is, and it's relatively unique to science, which is independent implementations and my theory tell me what results it should get, and it gives me those results. That was not really as silly as it sounds, because it sounds really silly, right? You're like, it gives me what I expect, therefore I think it's correct. Well, no, because independent implementations and this kind of multiple dependent pieces of theory tell you what to expect, and that helps to iteratively shape your thinking. It's very different than, you know, writing a test suite to test a piece of ERP. But if we just tell people to open source their code, then we're essentially saying, take code that has a logic of correctness that I wrote it myself, I know it really well, I know its limitations, I know what parameters will work with it, make it available to people as open source, and then the other people come along and they apply logic 2 to it, which is, it's open source, lots of people use it, must have been checked out really well, and then we could get into, you know, serious correctness problems. And that's, I think, a downside that people aren't really thinking that carefully about with just getting people to release more code. So, but archiving is the solution, making differentiation. Yeah.
Well, I'll just make a quick comment. Can't you also regard open sourcing as a method of documentation? Getting people to document code is really difficult. But if it's a low barrier to entry, I just publish it out there so you can go and look at it and you can work your way through it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's kind of a digression.
No, I think it's relevant.
And going back to that, your question or your point about data site, I think that that's another parallel, which is if you think about a data set not just being a static snapshot in time, but of a data collection. If you're looking at sky surveys or you know, lots of Earth data where you're constantly improving it, the data and your interpretation of that data based on your software, both of these things are evolving over time. And so how important is that at that junction is snapshotting, this is the data that I was looking at, and this is the software that I was using to interpret that data at that moment in time, versus saying, this is the approach that I took, and when you come back to it 3 years later, the data may be different and the software analysis is different.
I mean, I think that is a question that's really worth pursuing, because I don't know that there's a kind of specific, just one answer to that question. I think it's going to be quite contingent. I really like the idea that if I use, let's say the digital, like a Sky Survey or GenBank, if I use it, and I use it in some code, I write an executable paper, wouldn't it be nice if that data set then told me the set of citations that I ought to use? Right, it's going to be one for the person who set up the framework, maybe one for someone who implemented it, one for somebody who actually collected the data in the field that contributed just that little small piece of data. And that's feasible, right? That reduces the work for the authors. It's a nice kind of technical solution. So we could do that with data. We can also do that with software. So what we're trying to do at the moment with R is each R package implements the citation function, which is meant to tell you what citation the author wants for this. So we're going through all the packages and finding out, well, A, how much people even use that, and B, could we analyze the R history file so that when somebody writes some code with R, they can just go kind of like meta citation, and it'll tell you all the citations, all the packages you used, and then all the citations for all the dependent code that package used. Those all this data is available, right? And then it gives you like the 7 citations.
Like the old Easter eggs in Excel, where you get the wall of all the developers who look at
there you go.
software.
There you go.
Did you check academic search?
I haven't yet. I'm
Oh,
looking
got
forward to
to
knowing
try
more
that.
about that.
That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
Give you critical mass of citations that's needed.
Mhm.
They tell you the training, tell you the call. I just tried a call for papers.
Oh, right.
Really fascinating. Academic search.
Yeah, I'd love to
Exactly
learn more
what
about
you're
that.
looking for.
We'll,
You know,
we'll,
tell
we'll
me
spend some
the
time on that in the next hour, or after lunch. So any other last questions? Well, fantastic. Thank
Great.
you very much, James.
Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.